Welcome in. Wherever you are, midnight or morning, city lights or countryside quiet, I'm glad you're here. Maybe you've had one of those days. Too many tabs open in your mind, the weight of the world buzzing under your skin. Or maybe you're just looking for a story, not the kind you find in textbooks, but the kind that feels forbidden, hidden in shadows, written in blood and whispered prayers. Dim the lights, turn on a fan if you have one. Let the hum blur the edges of the present. Take a deep breath and settle into the dark, not with fear, but with curiosity. You're safe here, but the story we're about to unravel, it is anything but safe. Tonight we journey into the heart of power wrapped in silk and stained glass, where incense smoke veils corruption and holy titles disguise human darkness. We're going back to a time when the papal crown was not always a symbol of grace, but a throne for sin, a mask for tyranny. Let me tell you about a boy who became a pope, not a saint, not a shepherd, a sinner with a scepter. And as always, let me know where you're watching from and what time it is for you. This story deserves to be heard at the right hour. Let's begin. He was barely a man when the keys to the kingdom were dropped into his hands, not by angels, not by apostles, but by ambition and blood. His name was Octavianus, and in the year 955, as Rome gasped under the weight of feuding nobles and a hollowed-out church, he became Pope John XII. 18 years old, no wisdom, no discipline, no hunger for the divine, only appetite, for pleasure, for power, for everything that could be touched, consumed, or conquered. And Rome watched. Some say the city was already bleeding when he arrived, crumbling under its own sin, the air thick with betrayal. But others claim he tore it open, that he dragged the church's last semblance of purity into the gutter and grinned as it drowned. His father, Alberic II of Spoleto, had ruled Rome like a warlord, a shadow pope who never wore the mitre, but who called every shot from behind the curtain. On his deathbed, he forced Rome's nobles to swear that they'd make his son pope when the time came. It was less a transition than a coronation of corruption, and so the boy walked into the papal palace not as a servant of God, but as a prince stepping into his inheritance. What does a boy do when given absolute power? What does any man do when told he answers only to heaven? In John's case, he filled the Lateran Palace, the holiest residence in Christendom, with lovers, musicians, gambling tables, and violence. The halls that once echoed with prayers became saturated with moans, laughter, and screams. Historians of the time claimed he turned it into a brothel, and not just any brothel, one with no boundaries. They say he slept with nuns, with widows, with married women who came seeking confession and left stained by far more than sin. Some said he committed incest with his own niece. Others accused him of toasting the devil, of invoking pagan gods during banquets, of turning the sacraments into parodies, drinking toasts with wine meant for communion, laughing over the altar like it was a tavern table. The records are fragmentary, colored by rage, by shame, by centuries of editing. But beneath the exaggeration, a terrifying pattern holds true. John did not wear the robe of Christ. He wore it like a costume, and under it was a boy drunk on the idea that no one could stop him. Except Rome was not a city of silence. Whispers traveled fast, and fear traveled faster. Nobles who once bent the knee began to tremble not with loyalty, but with dread. His own allies began to ask, how far will this boy go? How many commandments will he mock before the heavens send a reckoning? But John wasn't listening. He was busy hunting, not souls but enemies. He had men blinded, exiled, executed without trial. He let blood soak the stones of the city and called it divine justice. And then he did what would become his gravest mistake. He invited a king, Otto I, the powerful ruler of Germany, a man who had ambitions of uniting Christendom under his reign, had long looked south toward Italy. John, cornered by enemies and craving legitimacy, reached out. He crowned Otto as Holy Roman Emperor in exchange for military support. It was a dangerous bargain, one that demanded restraint, diplomacy, maturity. But John was still a boy. He broke the agreement almost immediately. He began conspiring with Otto's enemies, playing both sides in a deadly game he barely understood. And Otto, the emperor, was not a man to be crossed lightly. In 963 he returned to Rome, not as a guest, but as a conqueror. The city held its breath. John fled. They said he ran like a thief in the night, abandoning his throne, his robes, his dignity. Otto convened a synod, a council of bishops and Roman nobles, to strip John of the papacy. The list of charges read like a catalogue of hell: simony, perjury, murder, incest, sacrilege, and blasphemy. 49 separate crimes. And the church, some said even that list was merciful. But the story wasn't over. John returned the following year with an army of loyal thugs and criminals, slaughtered his enemies in the streets, and reclaimed the throne, briefly, because fate, or perhaps justice, had one more page to turn. They say he died during an act of adultery, that while in the arms of another man's wife he was struck down, not by a sword, but by something more mundane, a stroke, or a fall, or the hand of a jealous husband. No one knows for certain. He was 27, a decade of rule, 10 years of chaos, and a legacy that still casts a long, obscene shadow over the Vatican's history. Not every pope was a shepherd. Some were wolves in silk, and John XII may have been the worst of them all. But his story, his rise and fall, is only the beginning. What happened in Rome did not stay in Rome, because when holiness is hollow, when power corrupts absolutely, the darkness doesn't end with one man. Are you still with me? Good, then stay close, because as we continue, the shadows grow deeper. Last time we watched a boy become a pope, not by merit or miracle, but by manipulation. And we watched him fall, dragged down by his own appetites and pride. Pope John V was a warning written in flesh, but the Church did not heed it. Tonight we turn the page to another dark chapter, not one of wild orgies and drunken blasphemy, but of something colder, sharper, calculated. Dim the lights again. Let the white noise hum. And if you're watching from a quiet room or a sleepless night, listen close, because this isn't history. This is a confession dressed in centuries of silence. After the fall of John XIV, the papacy staggered like a wounded beast. Rome was no longer a sacred capital. It was a battlefield. Armies marched in, crowns were traded like currency, and the throne of St. Peter passed from hand to bloody hand. Power no longer belonged to saints or scholars. It belonged to survivors. And in this desperate struggle, one name begins to rise, slowly like a serpent through dust. Alexander VI. His real name was Rodrigo Borgia. Say it again. Borgia. A name that carries poison, seduction, and death like perfume. Before it became legend, before the word corruption seemed to wrap around it like ivy, it was just a name spoken in the halls of Spanish nobility. But Rodrigo would make sure the world never forgot it. Born in 1431 in Valencia, he rose through the church with charm like a knife hidden in silk. He was clever, handsome, and utterly, unapologetically ambitious. From the very beginning, he didn't want to serve God. He wanted to rule in his name. By 1492, the same year Columbus sailed toward the edge of the known world, Rodrigo Borgia bought the papacy. Let me say that again. He bought it. Gold passed through hands in the shadows. Favors were traded, promises made, and Rodrigo was crowned as Pope Alexander VI. Church didn't groan, it didn't collapse, it applauded, because by then corruption wasn't the exception. It was the air everyone breathed. And so, a man with children, openly, shamelessly fathered, with mistresses, with political enemies buried in shallow graves, now wore the fisherman's ring. And the Vatican, once the heartbeat of Christendom, became the stage for one of the most twisted dynasties in European history. Rodrigo wasn't content to rule Rome. He wanted to create an empire, a Borgia empire, and he would stop at nothing to build it. His children, especially Cesare and Lucrezia, were pawns and players in this game. Cesare, brilliant and brutal, was raised to be the church's general. A cardinal who never once pretended to be holy, He shed his robes for armor and led the papal armies like a warlord. Some say Machiavelli based The Prince on him. Others say even that book is too gentle. Lucrezia, her name drips with myth and scandal. Was she a seductress, a victim, a political chess piece passed from husband to husband, or something darker? They whispered of poison rings, of incest, of lovers who disappeared without a trace. The truth is blurred, but in the Borgia court, blurred truth was a currency. Alexander VI used the papacy not to guide the faithful, but to wage war, settle scores, and enrich his bloodline. He carved up Italy like a butcher, bribed kings, and turned cardinals into merchants of betrayal. He orchestrated murders from behind lace curtains and called it divine will. And through it all he smiled. He filled the Vatican with artists, yes. Beauty bloomed in those years. But so did death. So did terror. The same halls that held paintings by the masters echoed with screams after midnight. People went missing. Bodies floated in the Tiber. He held mass with one hand on the chalice and the other on a dagger. And yet the people still bowed, because power cloaked in God's name is the most seductive kind of fear. But even tyrants age, and in 1503 the Borgia Pope grew weak. Some say he was poisoned, a cup meant for someone else. Others say it was illness. But what's undeniable is this. He died surrounded not by priests, but by whispers. His body swelled, turned black. The Vatican struggled to find anyone willing to prepare his corpse. Even in death, he repulsed. His son Cesare tried to hold the dynasty together, but it crumbled. Rome turned its back. The Borgias fell, not with a bang, but with the slow silence of rot exposed to light. But the scars remained. Alexander VI had turned the church into a family business, one soaked in blood and secrecy. He didn't just sin in private. He built a world where sin was law and virtue was weakness. So ask yourself, what happens when the holiest office on earth is held by men who fear no judgment? When the shepherd turns predator? When the cross is a mask? These weren't isolated failures, they were symptoms. And if you look close enough, you'll see echoes of them in every age that followed. Don't look away. There's more. If you're still with me, let the fan hum, keep the lights low, and breathe through the silence. You're still here. Good. That means you're not afraid of the dark. Not the kind that flickers in corners or hides beneath your bed, but the kind that drips from golden ceilings and whispers through marble halls. The kind that wears a crown, a robe, a ring. The kind that smiles as it sins. If you've made it this far, you already understand. This isn't just history. This is a mirror. And tonight we hold it up to yet another face of power, distorted, smiling, rotting beneath the surface. No candles, no angels, no hymns, just us and the truth. Take a breath. Let it stretch long and low. You're not watching a documentary, you're stepping into a haunted cathedral of memory, and every echo here has blood on it. Let's walk in. After Alexander VIing, the church stood stunned, like a palace after a storm. The Borgia legacy left cracks in the Vatican's foundations, cracks filled not with repentance, but with hunger, because once the sacred is sold, it's hard to buy it back. And in those cracks another man rose, not as wild as John the Wethind, not as shameless as Alexander, but something colder. More precise, his name was Paul IV. Before he wore the white, he was known as Gian Pietro Carafa, a name sharpened on politics and Puritan fire. Born in Naples, carved by conflict, he rose in a time when the world was shifting. Protestant fires were breaking out in the north. Reformers were shaking pulpits, challenging the church's monopoly on truth. And Carafa, he didn't flinch. He wanted a return to purity, but not the kind you might think, not tenderness, not peace. His vision of purity was forged in control, surveillance, fear, a holy fist, clenched tight. He hated the Renaissance. He despised tolerance, and most of all, he loathed heretics. A word that in his mouth could mean anyone he didn't understand. So in 1555, when he became Pope Paul IV, Rome did not breathe easier. It held its breath. This was no Borgia party, no scandal in the sheets, no laughter in the corridors. This was something worse. Paul IV unleashed a reign of religious terror. The Inquisition, already feared, already bloody, became a beast under his rule, a machine. Its agents swept through cities like shadows with parchment and chains. Families disappeared, books were burned. Truth was narrowed to a single point, his. He revived the Index Librorum Prohibitorum, the list of forbidden books. Works of art, science, thought, banned, erased. Anything that questioned, anything that whispered doubt, was silenced. Copernicus, Erasmus. Even certain Bible translations were condemned, because to Paul IV, knowledge was not a gift from God. By now, we're not talking about isolated mistakes or bad apples. We're tracing a bloodline of corruption, not by accident, but by design. Each man we've met wore the papal crown not as a burden, but as a weapon. And tonight, we meet one more. So take a moment, let the fan hum, let your room dim just a little darker. This next story doesn't begin with war or scandal. It begins with diplomacy, the softest kind of sin. His name was Pope Leo X, but before the white robes, he was Giovanni de' Medici. Yes, those Medici. Born into a dynasty of bankers, art patrons, and power brokers, Giovanni never had a childhood like yours or mine. He was born with gold in his blood and ambition in his cradle. At just 8 years old, he was given a cardinal's hat, a title not earned, but gifted like a toy. Because the Medici didn't just rule Florence. They bought the church piece by piece. By 1513, Leo X sat on the throne of St. Peter. The world held its breath, a Medici pope. For some, it was a promise, for others, a warning. And the warning was right. At first glance, Leo X didn't seem monstrous. He wasn't brutal like Paul IV, not lustful like John the Athene, not serpentine like Alexander. He was charming, educated. He loved music, poetry, and beauty. He funded Michelangelo, he elevated Raphael. The Vatican glittered under him like never before. But underneath the marble, the gold, the velvet, something began to rot. Leo X believed the papacy should be majestic, lavish, a living expression of divine glory. So he spent, and spent, and spent. Feasts that drained the treasury, parades of gold, parties that blurred the line between worship and indulgence. He turned the church into a stage, and he was its star performer. But glory is expensive, and when the vaults ran dry, he didn't tighten his belt. He opened the gates of damnation and sold salvation. It was under Leo X that indulgences reached their most grotesque form. Buy a paper, buy forgiveness. Your sins cleansed, your dead relatives released from purgatory, and for the right price. Preachers were sent out like merchants. They stood in the town squares and shouted, "As soon as the coin in the coffer rings, the soul from purgatory springs." That wasn't poetry, that was policy. And Leo knew it. He didn't weep over it, he counted it. Because to him, forgiveness was currency. And St. Peter's Basilica, the grandest church on earth, would be built with the sins of the poor. But sin has a cost. And across the Alps, a storm was brewing. A German monk named Martin Luther watched this unfold with fury in his chest. He saw the church not as a sanctuary, but a market. And in 1517, he nailed 95 theses to the door of Wittenberg's church. Not a rebellion, not yet. Just a cry, "Stop selling God." But Leo didn't hear a cry. He heard insubordination. He laughed. Called Luther a drunken German who'd change his mind once he sobered up. He never did. Instead, Luther lit a fuse, one that exploded across Europe. A reformation, a fracture, a fire that would never go out. And how did Leo respond? He excommunicated Luther, not with sorrow, not with reflection, but with the arrogance of a man who believed his signature could erase rebellion. It didn't. Luther's fire spread. Nations split, faiths fractured, and the church, Leo's church, was never the same. He didn't live to see the worst of it. Leo X died in 1521 suddenly. Some say of pneumonia, others say of a heart attack. One rumor, as never proven, says he was poisoned. Whatever the truth, one thing was clear. He died in debt, even with all his indulgences, his deals, his political games. He died leaving the church financially broken, spiritually wounded, and facing a schism that would rip Christendom apart. And still, the Vatican buried him in marble. Still, they called him the Magnificent. But history remembers him another way, not for his art, not for his charm, but for the moment he stood on the edge of reform and chose gold. He could have changed everything. He could have listened, repented, led, but he didn't. He was a pope who sold heaven and handed the keys of hell to history. So ask yourself, how many souls were sold so one man could build a palace? How many lives bent under the weight of holy debt? And more than that, how many still do? Because indulgences don't always come on paper. Sometimes they come as silence, as looking the other way, as comfort built on other people's fear. Keep listening, keep questioning. Because if Leo X was the Pope who sparked the Reformation, of course, here's part 5, following directly and naturally from the closing paragraph of part 4. No labels, no breaks. Just a slow descent into the next chapter, as if the story never paused. The next one? He would be the one who tried to smother it with blood. His name was Pope Paul III, and if Leo X lit the fire, and the church reeled in confusion, Paul stepped forward not to calm the storm, but to control it. He was old when he rose to the papacy in 1534, frail in body, but his mind razor-sharp, calculating. He was no fool. He saw what Leo had ignored, a world cracking in half. Protestantism wasn't just a spark anymore. It was a wildfire, devouring the authority of Rome from Germany to England and beyond. And Paul, he didn't panic. He pivoted. This was not the age of silk and song. This was the age of counter-reformation. And Paul made sure Rome would not go quietly. But don't mistake him for a reformer. He didn't mourn the corruption that drove men like Luther to rage. He simply knew it had to be better hidden, better dressed, more disciplined. So he called the Council of Trent, a gathering of bishops, scholars, and power brokers, cloaked in incense and Latin. They met to clean house, or so it seemed. But really, they met to reclaim control, to draw sharp lines in blood and doctrine, to declare what was heresy and what was Rome. And the list grew long. Scripture alone, heresy. Faith without works, heresy. Doubting the Pope's authority, heresy. And what followed was not unity. It was war, not always with swords, though there were plenty. Sometimes with chains, with whispers, with fire. Paul III strengthened the Inquisition, not the old medieval one. This was leaner, meaner. An iron fist in a cassock, torture chambers in stone basements, trials where the verdict came before the evidence. Burnings dressed up as redemption. In Italy, in Spain, in the Netherlands, the church declared, "You may run from Rome, but you cannot escape its reach." And if you think Paul watched all this with regret, think again. He knew exactly what he was doing. This was the same pope who, years before, had made his teenage grandsons into cardinals. Giovanni and Alessandro Farnese, barely men, handed holy titles like they were family heirlooms. This was a man who once kept a mistress in his youth, and only released her when the optics became inconvenient. A man who understood sin, not as something to confess, but something to control. But Paul was careful. He wore his mask well. No lavish scandals, no drunken feasts, just a stern, pious gaze and a blade hidden in doctrine. Under him, Rome was reborn, but not in mercy. In muscle, the Vatican became a fortress again. Its corridors echoed not with laughter, but with footsteps. Secret meetings, sealed letters, spies and informants working in God's name. And yet, he was praised. They called him a restorer, a reformer, a shepherd, because he did what the others could not. He made the church feared again, and that fear bought time. Time for Rome to solidify, to build new saints, new schools, new armies of Jesuits ready to flood the world with sermons and steel. And while the Protestant world splintered, the Catholic one dug in, deep. But let's not forget what lies beneath it all. Paul III was not saving souls. He was saving power. The throne of Peter had become too fragile, too exposed. And he built walls of orthodoxy around it, higher and colder than ever before. He didn't repent for Rome's past. He weaponized it. And when he died in 1549, the Vatican wept, not for the man, but for the strength he gave it. Ask yourself, what's worse? A pope who sins openly like John the Foin, a pope who sells heaven like Leo X, or one who wraps sin in sacred language and calls it salvation? Because Paul didn't just try to stop the Reformation. He taught the church how to survive it. With silence, with suppression, with the slow grind of centuries, and that is a power no fire can burn. By now, you know what this is. It's not just history, it's confession. Not the kind whispered behind a veil, but the kind scratched into stone, buried beneath centuries of incense and blood. And once you've begun listening to the walls, you can't unhear them. So stay close. Let the hum of your fan drown out the world. Let the dark wrap around your shoulders. This part is colder, because now we meet a pope who turned the church into an accomplice, not to salvation, but to death. Pius V, the holy enforcer, sainted now, revered by some. But beneath the title, beneath the halo, a storm. He was born Antonio Ghislieri in 1504, in poverty. He knew hardship, hunger. But that hardship didn't soften him. It forged him, hardened him like iron. As a boy, he joined the Dominican order, a brotherhood of study and strictness. There he learned the power of silence, of control, of fear. By the time he rose to power, he was no longer the boy in rags. He was the fist of Catholic orthodoxy, cloaked in white. When he became pope in 1566, the world was already divided. Protestantism was no longer a rebellion. It was an empire. Catholic nations trembled. Heresy, it seemed, was the new language of Europe. But Pius V didn't come to speak. He came to crush. He revived the Roman Inquisition with a quiet, cold precision. Under his reign, entire communities vanished into the dark. He ordered the burning of heretics, not with rage, but with the slow logic of a man convinced that flames cleanse. He tightened control over books, banned any hint of dissent, and brought censorship to a level that turned curiosity into danger. But his reach didn't end with ideas. It reached into politics, into power, into war. In England, Queen Elizabeth had taken the throne. Protestant, strong, unyielding. Rome hated her, but Pius went further. He issued a papal bull, Regnans in Excelsis. It excommunicated Elizabeth, declared her a heretic, released her subjects from loyalty. In effect, he made rebellion holy. It wasn't just words, it was a loaded weapon. Across England, Catholic uprisings stirred. Assassins plotted. Not all succeeded. Some were caught, tortured, executed. But Pius didn't flinch. He'd drawn the line in blood and dared the world to cross it. He wasn't done. He forged the Holy League, an alliance of Catholic states against the Ottoman Empire. And in 1571, at the Battle of Lepanto, Christian forces defeated the Ottomans in a massive naval war. It was one of the last great religious victories for Rome. The church rang its bells, statues were raised, and Pius, he took it as divine approval. But victories are masks, because behind the Holy League, behind the burning of heretics and the prayers for soldiers, there were darker stories. Stories of Jews expelled, ghettos expanded, forced conversions, punishments for anyone who dared live outside the rigid box of truth. Pius didn't simply defend the church. He narrowed it, cut away everything that wasn't absolute, including humanity. And still he was praised. They called him righteous, strong, unbending in faith. They canonized him, made him a saint. But what is sainthood when it's built on ashes? Ask yourself, is holiness proven by victory, by orthodoxy, by erasing anything that questions your grip on truth? Or is that just tyranny baptized? Pius V never smiled much. His portraits show a thin man with sunken eyes and pursed lips, as if even the act of painting him required solemnity. He lived in simplicity, yes, ate little, wore rough garments, shunned luxury. But simplicity is not the same as mercy. He wasn't like Leodax, draped in velvet drinking gold. He wasn't like Alexander VI, whispering deals in silk sheets. Pius was more dangerous than both, because he believed utterly that he was right. And when a man believes that, he can commit horrors with a clean conscience. He can turn torture into ritual. He can turn death into duty. He can call it justice and sleep soundly. He died in 1572, just a year after Lepanto. They buried him with reverence. They lifted his name in litany. St. Pius V, they say. But if you listen closely, if you press your ear to the walls of the Vatican at night, you might still hear the crackle of the fire and the silence of those who disappeared beneath his righteousness. This was not just a pope. This was a warning in white robes. Because the man we meet now didn't come from the gutter. He rose from the cradle of opulence. He wasn't forged in fire, he was polished in mirrors. And the sins he brought to the papacy weren't hidden in torture chambers or secret trials. They were paraded in the open, wrapped in velvet, perfumed and blessed. He was born Alessandro Ludovisi, but the world would come to know him as Pope Gregory XV. And his reign would prove that not all popes sin by accident. Some do it in style. It was the year 1621, when he took the papal throne. The church was still trembling from the aftershocks of the Reformation. Europe was divided. Wars of religion raged from city to city, neighbor to neighbor. The 30 Years' War had already begun, a conflict not just of territory or power, but of belief, of souls. Into this chaos stepped Gregory. He was old, sickly, barely able to walk. But don't let the frailty fool you. His mind was still sharp, and his family was hungry, because Gregory was a pope, but he was also a Ludovisi, and the Ludovisi name meant ambition. Within weeks of his election, he made his teenage nephew, Ludovico Ludovisi, a cardinal, not for his piety, not for his theology, but because blood ties were the true sacraments of Vatican politics. Ludovico was young, flamboyant, and ravenous. He lived like a king, threw parties that made even Roman nobles blush, and spent money like the church had a bottomless vault. And Gregory let him, because Ludovico wasn't just a nephew. He was Gregory's eyes, his mouth, his knife. Through him, Gregory ruled. And through him, the Ludovisi family siphoned wealth and power into their hands. Fast, unchecked, and unapologetic. But the corruption wasn't even the darkest part. Gregory XV also did something far more permanent, far more devastating. He institutionalized the Inquisition. Before him, it was a scattered weapon, used differently in Spain, Italy, France. Brutal, yes, but inconsistent. Gregory changed that. In 1622, he created the Congregation for the Propagation of the Faith, the Congregatio de Propaganda Fide. On the surface, it sounded noble, a missionary arm, a way to spread the gospel to far corners of the world. But underneath, it was control. Cold, calculated control. A network of spies, informants, missionaries who reported not just conversions, but suspicion. A system designed to monitor, judge, and silence. No longer would heresy be a matter of interpretation. Now it had a committee, a ledger, an executioner with a stamped approval. Gregory understood something vital. You don't need to be feared to be powerful. You just need to be everywhere. And so he built a church that watched quietly, listened endlessly, and never forgot. He also played with prophecy. During his reign, he officially introduced the method of secret conclave ballots, the very system by which popes are still elected today. He made the papacy more mysterious, more hidden, more ritualized. He created the illusion of divine selection, while locking the process in smoke and whispers. No more public pressure, no more popular will. Only the cardinals, only the silence, only Rome. And then, just 2 years after becoming pope, Gregory died. A short reign, just over 2 years. But in that time, he reshaped the church's spine. He institutionalized power. He monetized nepotism. He made spying into sacrament. And when he was buried, the Vatican did not tremble. It adjusted, it adapted, because Gregory didn't shock the church. He refined it. He was not grotesque like John Thocene, not flamboyant like Leo X, not merciless like Pius V. He was quiet, surgical, a man who understood that the deepest scars are the ones that don't bleed. And as the Ludovisi family celebrated their newfound wealth, as Rome glittered under the weight of indulgence and intimidation, one truth hung in the air. The popes were no longer shepherds. They were dynasties, families, and the flock? The flock was only there to feed them. So as you sit there letting this all settle, ask yourself, what happens when a religion built on sacrifice becomes a kingdom built on inheritance? What happens when power stops fearing God? Tonight we draw back the curtain, not gently but with a sudden tear, and step into the velvet-draped, wine-soaked shadow of a man who turned the Vatican into a stage. A man who didn't hide his appetites. He crowned them. Welcome to the reign of Pope Urban VIII, the Baroque Pope, the Pope of spectacle, empire, and betrayal. He came to power in 1623, just months after Gregory XV slipped into the grave. His real name was Maffeo Barberini, and if that surname makes you think of power, it should. Because under Urban, the Barberini family would feast like royalty, not quietly, not ashamedly, but in full view of God, man, and marble. Urban wasn't a brute. He was brilliant. Poet, scholar, lawyer, fluent in diplomacy and deceit. He understood art, understood image, and above all, he understood that beauty could make people forget where the bodies were buried. He commissioned sculptures, frescoes, fountains. He hired Bernini, yes, that Bernini, to remake Rome in his image. The Vatican bloomed with splendor, gold leaf on ceilings, marble saints twisting in agony, a city of light, built over darkness. Because while the facade shimmered, the sins spread. Urban declared nepotism not just acceptable, but necessary. His brother was made a cardinal, his nephews given armies, titles, palaces. One nephew, Taddeo Barberini, became commander of the papal army, enriched with military contracts that bled the treasury dry. Another, Francesco, was made cardinal at just 22. These weren't appointments. They were investments, and the dividends were immense. The Barberini family looted ancient tombs, melted priceless bronze from the Pantheon to build cannons, and stamped the papal crest on everything they touched: coins, churches, street signs. They had a saying, "Quod non fecerunt barbari fecerunt barberini." What the barbarians didn't do, the Barberini did. And Urban? He didn't blink. He wrapped himself in silk and sacrament, delivering sermons on humility, while his family drained the coffers. He spoke of peace while funding wars. He painted his sins in gold, framed them in scripture, and dared the world to call them what they were. But power always overreaches, and Urban's downfall began not with a sword, but with a telescope. Because in his time, a man named Galileo was peering into the sky, seeing moons, stars, movement not around Earth, but the sun. Heliocentrism, a heresy, a truth. Galileo, once a darling of the church, thought he could reason with Urban. They had dined together, laughed, shared poems, but Urban had changed. He saw Galileo's theories not just as scientifics, but personal, an insult to papal authority, a challenge to divine order. And when Galileo published his dialogue concerning the two chief world systems, featuring a character who, many believed, mocked the Pope's views, Urban snapped. He ordered Galileo before the Inquisition. There, under threat of torture, the aging scientist knelt and whispered the words, "I abjure, curse, and detest." And thus truth was silenced, by a man in a golden robe, by a church that feared being wrong more than it loved being right. Urban condemned Galileo not just to house arrest, but to historical exile. And yet, the stars still moved, the earth still turned, and God, if he watched, said nothing. Urban VIII died in 1644. He left behind bankrupt coffers, a bitterly divided church, and a city both radiant and rotten. His enemies pounced. His family was exiled. His legacy stained, but the art remained. The fountains still flowed. The saints still wept in marble silence. So what was he? A lover of beauty, tyrant in cassock and gold, a man who gave the church its most stunning facade, while rotting its foundation? Ask yourself, is it better to be feared and forgotten, or remembered for what you destroyed? The room is quiet now. Your screen glows like a dying candle. The world outside is asleep, but we are still here, drifting deeper into this catacomb of broken crowns and stolen holiness. You've seen the popes who sinned in silk. You've heard the whispers behind veils of gold. But now, we come to one who needed no mask, because his sins were not hidden. They were shouted, not painted on chapel ceilings, but carved into skulls. Meet Pope Innocent VIII. The irony of his name, it's so sharp it could bleed you. He was born Giovanni Battista Cibo in 1432. A minor noble, ambitious, clever. He rose through the church not by vision or virtue, but by calculation, by knowing exactly how much a soul cost in silver. In 1484, he ascended to the throne of St. Peter, and what followed was not a reign. It was a feeding. Innocent inherited a Vatican already bent beneath corruption, but instead of cleansing it, he sank deeper. He found the rot, and called it order. He sold indulgences, the absolution of sins, not just for the dead, but for the unborn. Theologians argued. He laughed, because theology didn't fill treasuries. Gold did. He appointed dozens of cardinals, many of them wealthy bankers and warlords, men who could barely fake piety, men who paid for their titles with coin and blood. And the papacy? He treated it like a throne of flesh. He fathered children, openly, not whispered affairs in candlelight, but public proud paraded. He acknowledged at least 2 bastards, one of them Franceschetto. He shoved into power like a spoiled prince. When Franceschetto gambled away fortunes, Innocent covered his debts. When he asked for land, Innocent gave him titles. The Holy Father, they called him. But not for the church, for his own dynasty. And still, that was not his darkest crime. Because in 1487, Innocent issued a bull, a decree that would ripple across Europe like a slow, spreading sickness. It was called Summis Desiderantes Effectibus. Its target, witchcraft. With a stroke of the pen, Innocent declared that witches were real, that they threatened the world, and worse, that they must be hunted. He empowered 2 inquisitors, Heinrich Kramer and Jacob Sprenger, zealots, obsessed, cruel. And from that empowerment came Malleus Maleficarum, the hammer of witches, manual of torture, suspicion, misogyny, a book soaked in fear. Under Innocent, the witch hunts were not just local madness. They became doctrine. People, mostly women, burned in village squares, hung from trees, drowned in frozen rivers. Some were healers, some were midwives, some were just lonely. But under Innocent, their screams became part of the church's great silence, sanctioned, blessed, ignored. It said he died in 1492, the same year Columbus set sail toward the New World, the same year Spain expelled its Jews, the same year so many doors slammed shut on reason and light. When Innocent lay dying, he begged for the blood of young boys to be transfused into his veins. 3 children were brought to him, all died. He did too. No miracles, no redemption. Just one more pope whose legacy dripped with the cries of the forgotten. And when they sealed his tomb in St. Peter's, they also sealed something else, a warning that when the church stops serving God, it becomes something worse than corrupt. It becomes dangerous. But stay with me. The next pope, he would not hunt witches. He would resurrect empire, still walking the marble corridors with me step by step, whisper by whisper. By now, the silence speaks louder than the words. You know what this is, not a history lesson, but a seance. We're conjuring the ghosts of power and they're answering. So let's not slow down. Tonight we arrive at a name spoken with reverence and revulsion. A pope whose ambition reached past heaven, grasping not for souls, but for kingdoms. Julius II, the warrior pope. He did not wear white robes and kneel in prayer. He wore armor. He rode into battle. He commanded armies. He was born Giuliano della Rovere in 1443, a nephew of Pope Sixtus IV, which in this era was the closest thing to a royal birthright. Even before he claimed the papal throne, Giuliano had a reputation, fierce, unrelenting, and untouchable. He was made a cardinal at 28, not for his faith, but for his blood, and when the time came, he seized the papacy like a fortress. In 1503, he was crowned as Pope Julius II, named not after a saint, but Julius Caesar. That alone should have warned the world. He didn't see himself as the vicar of Christ. He saw himself as a general of destiny. From the moment he took office, Julius wasn't interested in sermons or salvation. He wanted conquest, and he brought war to the doorstep of the church. He formed coalitions, negotiated with mercenaries, and marched at the head of his armies, sometimes clad in full plate armor, the papal standard fluttering behind him. Imagine it, the Holy Father riding into battle not with a cross, but a sword. He launched campaigns against cities that resisted papal rule, Bologna, Perugia, Venice. And when diplomacy failed, he turned the ground red. Julius wasn't defending Christendom. He was expanding it. Under him, the papal states became a military force. Rome didn't just pray, it conquered. But even that wasn't enough. Julius wanted glory, not in doctrine, but in stone. And so he summoned the greatest artists of his time, Michelangelo, Raphael, Bramante. He commissioned the rebuilding of St. Peter's Basilica, not as a place of worship, but as a monument, a legacy etched in marble. He ordered the painting of the Sistine Chapel ceiling, not to honor the divine, but to assert his power, to show that under his rule the church wasn't just eternal, It was imperial, but power, as always, comes at a price. His wars drained the treasury. His vanity angered kings. His ruthlessness in his obsession with empire, Julius deepened the divide between the papacy and the people. Faith became theater, doctrine became law, and the poor, the forgotten, became dust under marching boots. He excommunicated enemies like chess moves. He signed treaties in candlelit chambers, only to break them by dawn. And the people of Rome, they watched, they waited, and many began to wonder, was this pope leading them or ruling them? He died in 1513. No last confession, no whispers of remorse, just a throne left warm for the next man, and a church now split between those who worshipped him and those who feared him. The Renaissance bloomed around him, but under that bloom something darker was taking root. Because Julius didn't just make the church rich in gold, he made it ripe for revolution. And very soon, a German monk would hammer a door and the Catholic world would fracture. But that's not quite where we're going yet. Because between Julius and the fire to come, there was another pope, a man of lust, of poetry and poison. You haven't looked away, not once. Not when the robes were stained with wine, not when the hymns turned into war cries, and not when popes became kings, then kings became monsters. So here you are, still breathing in the incense and ash, still listening for truth beneath centuries of silence. And now the air grows sweet, too sweet, like overripe fruit, hiding rot beneath velvet skin. Tonight we descend into the reign of Pope Leo VI, the Medici Pope, the man who laughed while the church cracked. Born Giovanni di Lorenzo de' Medici in 1475, Leo was nobility before he ever held a crucifix. The second son of Lorenzo the Magnificent, raised in the palaces of Florence, bathed in philosophy, money, and Machiavelli. By age 13, he was a cardinal. By 37, a pope. He never stood a chance. To Leo, the papacy was not a burden of the soul, but a prize, a jewel to wear, a stage to perform upon. He loved art. He loved music. He adored feasts, festivals, the theater. And why not? He was a Renaissance pope in the city of gods. Rome to him was not a holy city. It was a canvas. Under Leo, the Vatican sparkled. He funded artists like Raphael. He completed the foundation of the new St. Peter's Basilica. He revived the ancient glories of Rome, sculpture, architecture, the illusion of eternity. But as the marble rose, so did the debts, because Leo lived as if the treasury were infinite. He spent like a king drunk on daylight. Banquets of peacock and swan, golden plates, parades that lasted days. And when the gold ran dry, he found a new currency, salvation, indulgences. He sold them across Christendom, parchment tickets to paradise signed by the Holy See, stamped with grace. For a price your sins were forgotten. For more, your ancestors were saved. The poor scraped their pockets. The desperate gave everything, and the church called it mercy. But somewhere far to the north, a German monk was watching, reading, fuming. Martin Luther. He saw Leo's indulgences not as grace, but as fraud, not holy, but heresy. And in 1517, Luther hammered his 95 Theses to the door of the Wittenberg church. Not a rebellion, not yet, but a spark. And Leo? He laughed. This friar's quarrel doesn't concern me, he said. He didn't see the fire catching, didn't hear the foundations cracking. He excommunicated Luther, declared him a heretic. And still, the people listened to the monk, not the pope, because they had tasted truth, and truth cannot be excommunicated. Leo died in 1521. He was buried in Rome beneath layers of art and incense, as if the beauty could hide the debt, as if music could drown out the thunder approaching. But it was too late. The church had been wounded, not from without, but from within, and the wound would soon become a rift. So ask yourself, what is more dangerous, a pope who rules with fire, or one who laughs while the world burns? Leo never raised a sword, but he armed a revolution with parchment, with indulgence, with silence. The Reformation had begun, and it would not be undone with gold or prayers. Stay with me, because after the fire starts, someone always tries to smother the smoke. The fire is burning now. You can smell it, wood, ink, old blood. The past isn't quiet anymore. It's screaming through locked cathedral doors. And still you follow, still walking beside me, barefoot across this shattered altar. So let me take you to the man who stood in the ashes, not to mourn, but to control. Pope Paul III, born Alessandro Farnese in 1468, a man of contradictions, of calculation, of timing. He was not young when he became pope in 1534, already gray at the temples, seasoned by the rot of decades in Rome's political shadows. He had seen it all. The Borgia poisons, the Medici splendor, the Luther flame, and when he slipped on the papal tiara, he knew he was not inheriting peace. He was inheriting a battlefield. The Reformation had torn Christendom in two. Germany was fractured. Switzerland rebelled. England gone. Its king now pope in his own right. The Vatican was bleeding influence. Paul didn't panic. He planned. He didn't wear armor like Julius. He didn't throw feasts like Leo. He wore a mask of reason. And behind that, a mind sharpened like a blade. He summoned the Council of Trent. Gathering meant to confront the reformers, but not to apologize. No, to dig in, to declare doctrine, to double down. Under Paul III, the church didn't ask where it had gone wrong. It roared that it had never been wrong. That indulgences were misunderstood, not sinful. That tradition was truth. That Rome was eternal. But he wasn't just interested in debates. He wanted order, so he turned to a new kind of warrior. Not soldiers, not inquisitors, but Jesuits. He approved the Society of Jesus in 1540, a disciplined brotherhood founded by Ignatius of Loyola. Men trained like military monks, fluent in languages, science, rhetoric. They didn't just preach. They infiltrated, educated, converted. Where Luther wrote theses, the Jesuits wrote curricula. Where Protestants shattered statues, the Jesuits rebuilt minds. Paul unleashed them like a tide, into Germany, India, China, the Americas. And in many places they stemmed the Protestant flood. But the cost? Suppression. Censorship. The reawakening of the Inquisition. Paul III revived it. Not the old medieval version, but a more modern, centralized holy office. Books were burned, ideas condemned, minds corrected. He even turned against his own blood. He had once elevated his grandsons to high offices, Giovanni and Ottavio Farnese, symbols of old nepotism, the very thing Protestants raged against. But later, he distanced himself, tried to clean his own legacy before death could write it for him. He was not holy, not innocent, but he was clever. So was he a reformer, a tyrant, a savior in a dying church, or just another man who saw God's house as a chessboard? Maybe all of it. But one thing is certain. He was the Pope who turned the church into a fortress, and inside that fortress, men would rise insolence to hunt. Because next we enter the era of spies in cassocks, of dark rooms, of whispered interrogations. It's cold now. Not the chill of winter, but the breathless stillness of a locked room, where every word is a risk, and every silence a sentence. The fire of the Reformation still flickered beyond Rome's walls. But within them, a colder flame was taking shape. A quiet, creeping force, a system of eyes, ears, and iron. And at its helm sat a man draped in white, who spoke softly, but struck like a blade through velvet. Pope Paul IV. He was born Gian Pietro Carafa in 1476. Noble, austere, burning with fury from the day he entered the church. Where others compromised, he condemned. Where others negotiated, he accused. To him, heresy was not an error. It was a disease. And the cure? Fair. Silence. Obedience. Long before he became pope, Carafa had helped forge the Roman Inquisition, a dark mirror of the one Spain had used to purge Jews and Muslims. He wanted it tighter, colder, more absolute. Not chaotic mobs, but a machine, run by priests, sanctioned by scripture, fed by fear. When he was elected pope in 1555, he didn't celebrate. He declared war. On Protestants, on philosophers, on printers, on Jews, on anyone whose breath strayed from Rome's doctrine. He believed the church had gone soft, and he would become its surgeon, cutting away decay no matter how much it bled. One of his first acts? Reviving and expanding the Index Librorum Prohibitorum, the Index of Forbidden Books. Galileo, Erasmus, Dante. Silenced. Entire libraries trembled. Printers wept. Words became weapons, and were treated as such. And outside the pages, people disappeared, accused, interrogated, tortured, not by mobs in the streets, but by church officials in sanctified darkness. You could be denounced by a neighbor, a family member, a jealous rival. No proof required, no defense possible, and Paul IV was not ashamed. He called it purity. He turned on the Jews of Rome, confined them to a walled ghetto near the Tiber River. The gates were locked at night, walls watched them by day. Their synagogues were desecrated, their voices silenced beneath Catholic bells. They were not souls to be saved, he believed, but sins to be isolated. And even within the church, he hunted. Cardinals feared him. Bishops walked on glass. He despised the Renaissance decadence of his predecessors. Tore down art, banned music, outlawed joy. Rome, under Paul IV, was not a city of saints. It was a prison of piety. And in that cold, gray prison, even the faithful began to whisper. When he died in 1559, the people did not mourn. They rioted. They stormed the Inquisition's offices, tore his statues from their pedestals, burned his coat of arms in the street. It was not grief that filled Rome that day, but relief. Because when Paul IV passed, so too did the breathless fear that choked every corner of the Vatican. But what did he leave behind? A legacy of vigilance, a church terrified of thought, a world where silence was safety and questions were crimes. He didn't reform the church. He entombed it, and yet his shadow stretched long, because after him came a pope who looked across the oceans, toward conquest, colonization, and conversion, not the fire of Inquisition, but the silver of empire. The fires dimmed, the doors reopened, but the smoke, it clung to the marble, to the ceilings, to the soul of Rome itself. And into that smoke stepped a man who smelled opportunity, not incense, not blood, but something sweeter, something global. Pope Gregory III. He wore the robe of a scholar, but beneath it ambition pulsed like a drum, not the old brutal ambition of swords and heresy, but the quiet kind, the kind that redraws maps, that resets time itself. He was born Ugo Boncompagni in 1502 in Bologna, a city of thinkers, mathematicians, lawyers. He studied canon law, rose through the church ranks not with fire, but precision. He wasn't theatrical, he wasn't cruel, but he was deliberate. And when he became pope in 1572, he looked out at a world shifting beneath his feet. The Protestant fracture was now permanent. The Reformation had hardened into entire nations. England was lost. The North was splintered. But the church still held something sacred. Time, the Julian calendar, the system that governed dates since the days of Caesar, was broken. It had drifted. The equinox slipped. The holy days no longer aligned with the heavens. A small thing, you might think. But time is power. To control the calendar is to control the rhythm of life itself. So Gregory did what emperors had only dreamed of. He rewrote time. In 1582, he issued the papal bull Inter Gravissimus, and with it, 10 days vanished. Gone. Erased. October 4th became October 15th. A blink. A tear in history. Some called it sorcery. Some called it madness. But Gregory called it order. This was not merely about the stars. It was about reminding the world that Rome still set the tempo. And not just in Europe. Gregory turned his gaze outward, to the seas, to the ships, to the jungles and deserts and shores now being claimed in the name of Christ. He blessed the missions to the Americas, Asia, Africa. He dispatched Jesuits to far corners, not to carry swords but ideas. Latin, astronomy, logic, doctrine. Under Gregory, conversion became strategy. And with every soul baptized under the sun in Peru, or the rain of Nagasaki, Rome swelled. But it wasn't all gentle tides. When Catholics in France faced persecution from Protestant factions, Gregory rejoiced in what followed. The St. Bartholomew's Day massacre. Tens of thousands of Protestants slaughtered in Paris and beyond. A river of blood dressed as divine justice. He struck a medal to celebrate it. Yeah, a medal. It bore his name. A reminder that Gregory, for all his civility, was still a pope in the old style where death could be doctrine, where policy could become punishment. He built colleges not only in Rome, but abroad, shaping generations of loyal clergy, thinkers, translators, spies. He made Catholicism more than a faith. He made it a machine a global rhythm set to a new clock. His clock. And when he died in 1585, Rome stood taller than when he found it, not because of marble or armies, but because of maps, because of time, because the sun still rose according to the Vatican's will. But behind that newfound order was something tightening, because with global reach came global fear, and the next pope would not look outward. He would look inward. He would ask, who still doubts, who still whispers? And he would turn the knife back toward Rome's own breast. The calendar had been reset. The streets of Rome had been cleared and paved. The doctrine had been sharpened into a blade. But what happens after a system is perfected? What happens when silence is mistaken for peace, and obedience is confused with faith? Enter 1585. A new name is whispered through the halls of the Vatican, not with awe, but with caution. Felice Peretti, a man born not to wealth, not to nobility, but to the soil. The son of a poor gardener in the village of Grotamare, the kind of beginning that either humbles a man or hardens him. He chose the latter. From an early age, Felice was different. Fierce, watchful. He did not laugh like other boys. He calculated. He joined the Franciscan order, taking vows of poverty and chastity. But never once did he vow to be harmless. He studied theology, canon law, languages, but not for enlightenment, for ammunition. He moved through the church like a man navigating a storm, with precision, purpose, and silence. Behind his sunken eyes was a furnace of ambition, burning low but never out. By the time he was elected pope in 1585, he was already feared. He shed his birth name, Felice, meaning happy, and chose instead a colder moniker, Sixtus Fei, a name that sounded like steel, like structure, like a verdict. And from the moment he placed the papal crown on his head, Rome began to change, not with celebration, not with vision, but with order. Under Sixtus, Rome became a city of straight lines and hard edges. He ordered the demolition of thousands of crumbling structures, razed chaotic neighborhoods, and carved new roads through the beating heart of the eternal city. He brought back water through ancient aqueducts, restored obelisks to their places of glory, constructed bridges, piazzas, systems. It was, in some ways, magnificent. In others, terrifying, because Sixtus did not build for beauty. He built for control. He didn't see a city. He saw a machine that needed tuning. Every street, every fountain, every citizen had to be made efficient, obedient, and silent. His justice was swift. His mercy was rare. Thieves were hanged in public squares. Prostitutes were whipped, paraded, exiled. Men who wrote too freely vanished behind stone walls. He once said, "Let justice be done, though the world perish." And he meant it. His Rome was not a sanctuary. It was a factory of virtue, powered by fear. But perhaps most chilling of all, he watched. It was said he moved through the streets at night, cloaked in black, listening to whispers, observing markets, shadows, sermons. No one ever saw his face, but everyone felt his presence. He didn't trust his cardinals. He didn't trust the clergy. He barely trusted God. He reorganized the curia, the papal government, into 13 strict congregations, each with defined roles, clear authority, and ruthless accountability. It was the church, turned into a bureaucracy of surveillance. He personally oversaw the congregation of the Inquisition. He read their reports. He approved their tortures. He blacklisted books not for heresy alone, but for thoughts too free. Authors, printers, philosophers, they all learned to be afraid of the man in white. And he was always watching. He built the Vatican Library's administrative systems, but limited access to its contents. Knowledge to Sixtus was not a right. It was a weapon, and only the Pope should carry it. He funded the Spanish Armada, blessed King Philip II's war against Protestant England. He prayed for the death of Queen Elizabeth, but in secret, he withheld the final payments. Because even in war, Sixtus played both sides. He was a pope who trusted no one, because he believed that holiness and power were not allies. They were enemies, and power always won. He ruled for 5 years, just 5. But in that short span, he transformed the Vatican from a palace into a fortress, from a holy court into a cold, silent engine of obedience. And when he died in 1590, alone, rigid, unrepentant, the air in Rome seemed to lift. There was no public mourning, no candlelit vigils, no tears. The people exhaled quietly, cautiously, and then they rushed to undo his laws, to soften the grip he left behind. 'Cause while Sixtus V brought order, he buried compassion. He built systems, but crushed souls. His Rome was clean, but bloodless, holy, but lifeless, and still, some whispered admiration. They said at least he made things work. At least he gave us structure. But at what cost? What is a church that runs like a machine, but forgets how to forgive? What is faith without breath? What Sixtus left behind was not a flame, but a cage around the flame. The cage had been built, stone upon law, law upon fear. And the church, though tall and gleaming on the outside, had forgotten how to breathe on the inside. Sixtus V was gone, and with him the iron hush he forced across the holy city. Now the doors were creaking open again. Candles flickered once more in forgotten chapels. Scholars dared to speak in corridors where once only silence lived. But in the echoes left behind there was still caution. The walls remembered. In 1590 a man stepped forward, or was pushed, to inherit not just the keys of heaven, but the ruins of a soulless Vatican, Pope Urban VII. His reign lasted 13 days. 13. He never wore the crown, never crossed the threshold of legacy. He died before he could move a single chess piece. They called it malaria. Some whispered poison. And just like that, the doors of change slammed shut before they'd even opened. And Rome, uncertain again, looked for someone stronger, someone older, someone who could hold the reins without pulling too hard. So in 1592, the College of Cardinals placed the crown on the brow of an aged scholar, a man of modest grace, mild temperament, and deep inner contradictions, Pope Clement VIII, born Ippolito Aldobrandini. Legal mind, a judge, a man shaped by law, but pulled towards something warmer. He was no zealot, no tyrant, no architect of fear, but in his hands was a church bent by centuries of ambition, and now it would bend again. The world around him was shifting. Empires rose and trembled. The Reformation was no longer a protest, and it was a reality. England was Protestant. Germany was fractured. France was bleeding. But Clement looked inward first. He believed in reconciliation, in healing old wounds, not reopening them. He extended olive branches where others offered swords. He pardoned King Henry IV of France, a Protestant who converted to Catholicism in exchange for peace, a gamble that enraged hardliners in Rome, but ended decades of religious war in France. Clement weighed doctrine against consequence and chose mercy. But mercy is a strange creature in the Vatican. Show too much, and they call you weak. Show too little, and they call you Sixtus. And Clement, for all his gentleness, knew when to sheath the smile. When Giordano Bruno, philosopher, mathematician, mystic, began speaking too freely, writing of infinite worlds, of a universe without center, of a God who did not fit inside the church's walls, Clement listened. He waited. And then he signed the death warrant. 7 years in prison. 7 years of interrogation, threats, cold stone, and isolation. And then, in 1600, in the heart of Rome, Bruno was burned alive, his tongue nailed to his jaw, his eyes open to the flame. They say he did not cry out. Clement did not attend. But he didn't stop it either, because mercy in his world had limits, and beyond those limits waited fire. But not all was shadow. Under Clement, art returned to the Vatican. He commissioned poets, painters, architects, and slowly color crept back into the marble. Not the golden extravagance of the Renaissance, but something subtler, more human. He invited scholars to the Vatican Library again. Not all, not freely, but carefully, with control. Knowledge, he believed, was no longer a threat. Could be shaped, guided, cleansed. He codified the index of forbidden books again, refined it, tightened it, but also removed several texts from its grasp. Clement was not afraid of ideas. He was afraid of chaos, and in Rome, chaos was always waiting at the door. He also made peace with science, carefully. He supported astronomers, allowed quiet conversations about the heavens. Galileo would rise during his papacy, and though the storm would not break until later, Clement allowed the breeze to pass through the Vatican walls. But the weight was always there, because Clement, despite his attempts at warmth, could not escape the structure left behind by Sixtus. The bureaucratic cage, the congregations, the obsession with surveillance and control. He ruled within the machine, and no matter how many candles he lit, He could not change the gears grinding behind the walls, and he knew it. He spent long hours alone in prayer, not for salvation but for guidance, not for glory but for balance. He fasted, punished himself, not for sins he had committed, but for the sins committed in his name. And when he died in 1605, Rome did not erupt. It didn't mourn like it once did for martyrs. It didn't exhale like it had with tyrants. It paused. Clement VIII was not a man of extremes. He did not burn the world, nor did he redeem it. But he tried. He tried to be both holy and human, to be soft without being broken, to be firm without becoming stone. He left behind a church not healed, but no longer bleeding, but just beneath the marble, just beneath the robes. Something ancient was still coiling, because after Clement, the world would get faster, more restless, more curious. Of course. Here is part 17, the final chapter of this haunting, immersive series, complete with a cinematic crescendo, a quiet, emotional CTA, and an atmospheric outro that lingers like fading candlelight. The tide had turned. Clement VIII was buried beneath marble and incense, and above his tomb the church stood still, but not at peace, because while he had tried to balance justice with compassion, to offer mercy without losing control, the world outside the Vatican walls had made up its mind. It wanted light. It wanted reason. It wanted truth without robes. The century turned, and in 1605 a new man stepped forward, a man who had watched the Renaissance rise, who had listened to the Reformation tear the church in half, a man who saw the stars through a telescope and called them dangerous. Pope Paul V. He came from the Borghese family, wealthy, politically sharp, unafraid, and he did not come to question the past. He came to preserve it. Where Clement opened windows, Paul sealed them shut. Where Galileo sketched the moons of Jupiter, Paul V. saw heresy. And so, in 1616, under his direct command, the Vatican issued its first formal condemnation of heliocentrism. The belief that the Earth was not the center of the universe was now not only false, but sacrilegious. It was the moment the Church declared war on the stars. Paul V. was not cruel in the style of Sixtus. He did not use fire or fear in excess, but he built walls, intellectual ones. He codified what could be known, and quietly erased what could not. Galileo, once celebrated, was warned, forbidden to teach, to write, to even whisper that the Earth moved. And still, it did. But Paul V didn't care. Truth was not his pursuit. Stability was. Structure. A world that didn't move under your feet. He saw the rise of Protestant thought, of empirical science, of individual reason, and he responded with marble, heavy, cold, unchanging. He commissioned art, yes. He expanded St. Peter's Basilica. He elevated the beauty of Rome's skyline. But even beauty in his hands was a fortress. The church under Paul V became a monument, grand and immovable. And beneath the surface, the thinkers, the artists, the quiet revolutionaries, they began to whisper again. Not in defiance, but in sadness, because they could see it. The age of belief, once so luminous, was dimming. Not because people had lost faith, but because the keepers of faith had locked the gates. And so, when Paul V died in 1621, there were no songs in the streets, no joyful bells, just another stone laid atop a wall that separated the past from the future. But history is a tide, and walls don't last, not even the ones built by popes, because even in darkness, truth waits, and when it returns, it does not knock. It breaks in. So what do we remember when we look back on these men in white? Their thrones, their doctrines, their marble tombs? Or do we remember the silences? The lives lost in flame? The books never read? The whispers that became storms? History doesn't always judge loudly. Sometimes it just remembers. And what it remembers depends on what we dare to uncover. Thank you for walking through this shadowed corridor of the past with me. If you made it this far, dim lights still glowing, a breeze still moving through your room. Your mind may be a little fuller, a little heavier. I'd love to know where you're watching from. Let me know in the comments. Tell me what time it is where you are, and whether you watched in silence or whispered with the ghosts. If you want more stories like this, subscribe only if you feel like it. There's more coming. Some darker, some stranger, and some that just might keep you awake longer than you planned. Until next time, keep the lights low, Keep your thoughts open. And remember, not every crown is holy, not every prayer is pure, and not every pope was a shepherd. Some were wolves, draped in silk, sitting on a throne of bones. Sleep well, if you can.